Hey there, drowsy historian here. Tonight we're not going to be executed, disemboweled, or buried alive. That would be too merciful. Instead, you're going on a journey, the kind that ruins your knees, your faith, and your ability to digest solid food. You are the underpaid, underfed, and entirely unprepared assistant to Marco Polo. Yes, that Marco Polo, the one who gets the credit, the glory, and the bedtime stories. You, meanwhile, will get fleas and frostbite, and an intimate, unforgettable relationship with intestinal parasites. So before your boots rot off and your last clean thought is lost somewhere in the Gobi Desert, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy falling asleep to the gentle sound of starvation, diplomatic failure, and slow emotional collapse. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I like to know who's out there quietly unravelling with me. Now lie back, close your eyes, and get comfortable, because Marco Polo's not going to carry those trade documents himself. You've never been what people would call important, or employable, or adequately bathed. You're the sort of person Venice has in abundance, young, vaguely literate, and slightly mouldy from living too close to the canals. You work odd jobs when they're available, and steal crusts of bread when they're not. Your most valuable possession is your ability to nod at the right time and pretend you weren't just daydreaming about cheese. So when someone says the name Polo, you assume they're talking about a neighbourhood fishmonger or a particularly flamboyant type of hat. You are incorrect. The Polos are merchants, serious ones. The kind who own maps and speak in multiple tenses. Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, brothers of considerable means and even more considerable moustaches, have already been to the east and back. And now they're going again, this time bringing Niccolo's son, Marco, who has just the right mix of charm, curiosity, and complete detachment from physical suffering. He's the kind of person who calls months-long desert crossings an adventure. You, on the other hand, call them how I die. You are not invited because of your skills. You have none. You are invited because Marco needs someone to carry things, sweep up after the camels, and, on particularly bad days, take the blame for whatever unspeakable diplomatic faux pas he just committed. You nod enthusiastically when asked if you've travelled before, omitting the detail that your longest journey to date involved falling into a gondola and floating half a mile downstream. You're promised a daily ration, a share of the profits, and the opportunity to see the world. You should have asked which parts of the world, and how closely you'd be seeing them. You should have asked a lot of things, actually. But you didn't, because you were hungry and stupid, which are two of history's most consistent travel motivators. Your first glimpse of Marco is underwhelming. He's young, bookish, and has the kind of smile that suggests he's never had to boil his own water. He shakes your hand like he's worried about catching something. And to be fair, he probably is. You stand there, swaying slightly from hunger, while he talks about courtly intrigue and divine destiny. Kublai Khan, he says, is a man of vision, a man of greatness, a man who has summoned them, you included, to bring knowledge and wisdom from the West. You're still not entirely sure who Kublai Khan is, but you nod anyway. That becomes something of a theme. The other assistants eye you with thinly veiled contempt. They're not much better off than you, but they hide it behind layers of confidence, filth, and multilingual muttering. You share a pallet in a cramped storeroom that smells like cheese, wet wool, and someone's dying hope. You're issued a tunic, a pair of boots that once fit someone else's feet, and a pack that you will come to hate with the kind of pure, sustained rage usually reserved for ex-lovers and tax collectors. Inside the pack are various scrolls, ink pots, and what might be a preserved lemon. No one explains why you're carrying a lemon. You try to look excited, you try to look like this is a step up. You even try smiling, but there's something about the way the Polos keep looking at maps and muttering about alternate routes that makes your stomach fold in on itself. You're told the plan is to travel east by sea, then continue overland to China. Marco calls it the journey of a lifetime. You're starting to suspect he means that literally, that it will take your entire lifetime, possibly more. The night before departure, you sit on a dock beside the Polo family's warehouse, watching rats pick through old fishing nets. The stars are out. The water glistens. Somewhere nearby, someone is throwing up in a bucket. It's the most peace you'll get for years. You consider backing out. You consider diving into the canal and letting the current take you wherever it wants. But you don't. Because this is your shot. Your chance to be part of something big. Something historical. Something that will almost definitely kill you. But hey, at least you won't be bored. And so you go to sleep that night on a pile of sacks, your head full of impossible cities and golden palaces, of riches beyond imagining and silk-lined glory. You dream of riding horses across open plains, of dining with emperors, of returning to Venice in a blaze of triumph. You dream of baths, of fresh bread, of someone saying your name with a shred of respect. You dream like an idiot. Because tomorrow you leave with the Polos, and tomorrow your real education begins. In sweat, in sores, in sorrow, and in the delicate art of carrying Marco Polo's ink without spilling it, even while vomiting off the back of a mule. The ship doesn't look seaworthy. It looks like something that should be gently pushed into retirement and maybe set on fire out of kindness, but the Polos insist it's fine. Well rigged, well provisioned, and perfectly capable of making the crossing. You aren't sure what crossing they mean, but after you stub your toe on a barrel of pickled something and nearly fall through a loose plank on the gangway, you start suspecting that capable is a word doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. You're assigned space below deck, which is a generous way of saying you'll be sleeping beside a crate of iron nails and a family of fleas who've already claimed ownership of your blanket. It's hot, dark, and smells like salt, sweat and sour fish that didn't make it to market in time. The sailors say things like, "She's a stubborn one," and slap the side of the hull like it's a drunk mule that needs encouragement. You don't know anything about ships, but you're fairly certain they shouldn't creak quite that much while still tied to the dock. Departure is delayed 3 times. Once for weather, once because the captain had drank too much vinegar wine and forgot where he put the rudder key, and once because Marco decided he needed to repack his belongings more efficiently. You watch him reorganize his scrolls, while the crew groans and the harbour smells like old ropes and disappointment. You think about pushing him into the water, just a little, just to see if he floats. You don't, of course. You need this job. Or at least, you need the theoretical coin at the end of it. When the ship finally launches, you feel a strange mix of terror and relief. Venice disappears behind you, its towers and domes shrinking into the mist like a city that knows you'll regret this. The sea is calm, the sun is warm. For exactly 14 minutes, it feels almost pleasant. Then the wind shifts, and the ship begins to buck like it's trying to throw you off on principle. Your stomach turns inside out, then outside in, then threatens to revolt entirely. You spend the next 3 days clinging to a rope and praying for either death or land, whichever arrives first. The sailors are no help. They laugh every time you retch, slap your back with a little too much enthusiasm, and offer you pickled eel as a cure, which you wisely decline. They smell like fermented salt and speak in a language that is 40% swear words and 60% personal insults. One of them insists on calling you pigeon. You have no idea why, but it feels accurate. You flutter, you panic. You're mostly useless. The name sticks. Meals on board are served in dented tin bowls and always involve some combination of beans, hard bread, and a meat substance that no one is willing to identify. You learn quickly to stop asking questions. The water barrels taste like they've been blessed by mildew and disappointment. One day, you find a weevil in your biscuit. You remove it, finish the biscuits anyway, and realise you've crossed an invisible threshold where your standards once lived. There is no privacy. You relieve yourself over the side of the ship with one hand on a rope and the other on your dignity, which is slipping fast. Bathing is a concept, not a practice. By the 5th day, the crust behind your ears has formed a kind of protective coating. You begin to think of it as armour, emotional if not functional. Marco, of course, is unfazed. He walks the deck with a journal in one hand and a faraway look in his eyes, like he's composing a sonnet about the colour of the waves. He asks you to fetch him fresh parchment while you're actively vomiting into a coil of rope. He lectures you on Phoenician trade routes, while your face is the exact colour of spoiled cabbage. You begin fantasising about him falling overboard and being eaten by something historically significant. You make landfall at Acre with a kind of broken enthusiasm that only comes from surviving something that didn't want you to survive it. The port is loud and chaotic, filled with shouting merchants, braying animals, and the unmistakable smell of spices and human misery. You stumble onto dry land, kiss the stones dramatically, and nearly get trampled by a man carrying 3 live chickens and a hookah. No one is impressed by your arrival. No one cares that you've just survived storms, vomiting, and 17 different kinds of rat. Marco makes a speech to no one in particular about the next leg of the journey, and you wonder if it's too late to feign death and become a local beggar. Probably, you're already listed on the manifests. That night, you sleep on a stone floor in a crowded inn with fleas, strangers, and the quiet certainty that if this was the easy part, the rest of the trip is going to be like dying slowly inside a sack of old onions. You leave Acre at dawn, riding a borrowed mule that already seems disappointed in you. The plan, as loosely described by someone who definitely wasn't listening to Marco, is to travel overland through the Levant and Persia, then rendezvous with a ship at the Persian Gulf. You don't ask how long it will take. You already know the answer is 2. The sun greets you like a personal vendetta. By noon, your clothes are glued to your skin, and your mouth feels like it's been filled with wool. There's sand in everything. Your boots, your ears, your soul. You thought the sea voyage was bad, but at least the water stayed outside your body. Now the heat seeps in and sits there like a squatter, radiating misery from your bones outward. Every breath tastes like dust and camel spit. You pass through cities with names older than memory: Damascus, Baghdad, Nishapur. Marco treats each one like a living museum, launching into lectures about ancient conquests and forgotten poets. You try to care, you really do, but it's difficult to feel inspired by Persian architecture when you're actively losing a battle with heat stroke and your shirt is permanently welded to your back. Still, you nod dutifully and pretend that the puddle forming beneath you is intellectual sweat, not desperation. Every city is a collision of culture and chaos. Traders shout in 10 different languages. Goats wander freely through the markets. And somewhere in the background, someone is always loudly arguing about religion. You learn quickly that your job is not just to carry Marco's supplies, but also to smile politely through every theological disagreement, avoid eye contact with armed men, and quietly inventory your body parts in case something gets cut off during a debate about heresy. Food becomes a game of risk management. Some days you're fed spiced lamb on fragrant rice, and for a fleeting moment, you remember what joy tastes like. Other days you're handed a bowl of something grey and steaming and told not to ask questions. You stop asking. You also stop chewing thoroughly. Your digestive tract isn't so much a system anymore as it is a war zone, and your stomach lining is its most tragic casualty. Water is another problem. In theory, there are wells. In practice, most are either dry, guarded by hostile locals, or flavoured with something that smells like rotting saddle leather. One day, you drink from a stream and spend the next 2 days experiencing what Marco politely calls intestinal distress, and you describe, less politely, as explosive betrayal. You begin to view every puddle with suspicion and every bowel movement with cautious optimism. You sleep in caravanseries when you're lucky, which are essentially stone motels for people with fleas. When you're not lucky, you curl up beneath a wagon and try to ignore the fact that something is chewing on your sandal. The nights are cold, the days are hot, your internal clock gives up and just starts guessing. Somewhere along the way, time stops being measured in days and becomes measured in blisters. The terrain changes constantly. You cross scrubby hills dotted with olive trees, salt flats that glare like polished bone, and mountains that rise out of nowhere like nature's middle finger. The roads are barely roads, just well-worn grooves in the dirt where other travellers have suffered before you. You try to feel a sense of connection with them. It doesn't help. You still smell like goat and failure. Bandits are a constant concern. The guards hired by the Polos are competent enough, but you notice they've started sleeping in shifts and checking their weapons more often. One night, you're woken by the sound of steel on steel and find yourself scrambling behind a crate while someone screams in Arabic and arrows whistle overhead. Marco later says it was a minor skirmish. You find an arrowhead embedded in your pack and quietly disagree. You do meet fascinating people, astronomers, poets, merchants who've travelled farther than you can pronounce. Marco interviews them, scribbles notes, and attempts to catalogue the known world. You hold his ink pot and try not to pass out. Every conversation is an education. Every handshake is an invitation to another disease. You've stopped keeping track of what you've caught. You just assume you're now a host for whatever thrives in sweat and disappointment. When you finally stagger into Hormuz, you're too exhausted to celebrate. Your feet are bleeding, your mule has abandoned you, and your last functioning shirt has taken on the texture of old parchment. The city itself is a blur of heat and noise, a bustling port filled with spices, silk, and the sour smell of desperation. You were supposed to catch a ship here and head straight to China. That was the plan. Hormuz is supposed to be a marvel, a glittering island port where east meets west in a glorious symphony of trade, diplomacy, and salt-crusted glamour. That's what Marco says anyway, as he strides ahead, eager to document its splendour. You follow behind him like a mangy dog, hobbling on cracked feet and trying not to collapse face first into a camel's behind. By the time you reach the gates, you smell like fear and fermented laundry, and the only thing you're symphonising is a symphony of internal bleeding. The harbour is busy, yes, full of ships, yes, but what no one tells you, what Marco conveniently leaves out of his enthusiastic rambling, is that most of these ships are barely more than splinters, held together by mould, prayer, and leftover fish bones. You squint at the nearest vessel and notice that one side appears to be held together with strips of leather and something that looks alarmingly like pastry dough. Another is tilted so dramatically to one side that it might actually be trying to sink itself before anyone can blame it for what's about to happen. Still, Marco is undeterred. He marches right up to the dockmaster and starts negotiating passage across the Indian Ocean like he's booking a river cruise. You, meanwhile, are assessing which parts of your body will float if the boat disintegrates. The dockmaster laughs, loudly. Then he looks at your group, squints at the horizon like he's checking for omens, and says, in no uncertain terms, that taking a sea route now would be the kind of decision usually made by men who no longer value breathing. The monsoon is coming, he explains, as if you needed more reasons to stay on land. The winds will shift, the currents will rebel, and the ocean will become a frothing death trap, so enthusiastic about drowning people, it hardly waits for them to leave shore. Several merchants have already tried. Their ships are now decorating the ocean floor, along with their teeth and possibly their camels. You hope briefly that this will be the end of the journey, that Marco will nod solemnly, reconsider his ambitions, and decide to settle down and open a spice stall instead. But no, Marco simply adjusts his scarf, thanks the dockmaster for his honesty, and announces that you will be continuing overland, overland, again, through deserts and mountains and probably more bandits, possibly more dysentery, definitely more suffering. At first you think he's joking, no one could be this optimistic. Then you remember Marco doesn't joke, he theorizes. He writes in ink that smells like mouldy plum pits and says things like, "The journey is the reward." You're fairly certain that philosophy was invented by someone who never had to poop in a sandstorm. The next few days are a blur of hopeless logistics. You were supposed to rest here. Maybe even eat something that didn't come out of a goat or a questionable clay pot. Instead, you're stuck helping the Polos re-provision. That means hauling sacks of grain that leak like badly stitched wounds and inspecting water skins that smell faintly of dead fish. It also means you're introduced to the local pack animals, half-mad, underfed beasts that look at you like they're planning something. You try to bond with one by offering it a date. It bites your sleeve instead and then sneezes directly into your face. Nights in Hormuz are no better. The inn is loud and overcrowded, full of travellers with more money and less misery. You curl up in a corner, pressed between a cracked wall and a pile of someone else's luggage, and try to sleep through the sound of a nearby merchant snoring like he's choking on his own profits. The air is hot and motionless. You sweat through your only clean shirt, which no longer qualifies as either clean or a shirt. You dream of water, not to drink, just to bathe in. Just for a moment, you'd give your remaining boot for a bucket of it. On your final day in the city, Marco takes you up to a hill overlooking the port. "Isn't it beautiful?" he says, gazing out at the sunset-drenched ships and the churning sea. You nod, because that's what you do now. Agree, endure, survive. You stare out at the boats and think about how close you came to escaping this journey through the mercy of a sea burial. But no, you'll continue, on foot, through terrain that scholars describe as unforgiving and common travellers describe using language that mustn't be repeated near a church. The sun dips below the horizon. Marco is already scribbling notes. The camels are being loaded. You're preparing, mentally, physically, spiritually, to walk straight into the gaping mouth of Central Asia with a man who thinks everything is an opportunity for discovery. You quietly consider drowning yourself in a roadside basin just to take control of your own narrative. But you don't, because no one's going to remember the assistant who quit in Hormuz, and because your boots are already moving eastward. They call it Dashti Loot, the emptiness, the Loot Desert. You suspect there are other names for it, whispered by locals and former travellers who live to regret the experience, names that translate roughly to the place hope goes to dehydrate and die. It's a stretch of cracked, blistered land in southeastern Persia where even the wind seems angry. Nothing grows here, nothing moves here, except apparently you. The journey begins with optimism, or at least the hollow echo of it. Marco describes the desert as a crucial passageway, as if you're strolling through a scenic park and not a sun-blasted wasteland where shadows go to evaporate. He insists on recording daily temperatures, marvelling at the texture of the sand and pointing out interesting rock formations. You, meanwhile, are actively liquefying from the inside out. Heat isn't quite the right word. This isn't warmth. This is punishment. The sun doesn't shine here. It bears down, hammering you from above with the casual cruelty of a god who got bored and decided to start microwaving people. The ground burns through your soles, the air scalds your lungs, and your clothes cling to you like hot rags dipped in misery. You used to sweat. Now you just leak. Your skin has stopped being skin and is well on its way to becoming a cautionary tale. Water becomes a holy substance. Rations are strictly controlled, each sip counted like coins in a dying kingdom. You carry a skin of it tied to your hip like a sacred relic and guard it with a possessiveness usually reserved for treasure or firstborns. When you drink, it isn't refreshing. It's a temporary stay of execution. It slides down your throat like a bribe to keep your organs functioning just a little longer. The sand isn't soft or golden. It's coarse and grey and gets into everything. Your clothes, your nostrils, your teeth. You don't know how it got into your ears when you've been wearing a head wrap, but there it is, whispering reminders of how far you are from anything remotely human. The wind picks up now and then, not to cool you, but to fling the sand into your eyes with a kind of bitter glee. You stop trying to blink it away. You just accept that vision is now optional. Nights offer no real comfort. The temperature drops suddenly and viciously, like the desert is punishing you for surviving the day. You curl up beneath your pack, teeth chattering, skin peeling, and wonder if this is what being slowly cooked and then flash frozen feels like. Your fingers go numb. Your lips crack so badly they start to bleed. You try to sleep, but the cold sinks into your bones like regret, and your dreams are full of fire, salt, and your own teeth falling out. The camels seem unimpressed by your suffering. They trudge forward with the resigned air of creatures that have seen hundreds of men like you fall to pieces and aren't taking bets on your odds. One of them sneezes on you and doesn't apologise. You hate that camel. You name him Alfonso, if only so you can blame something specific when you inevitably die. Conversation dries up quickly. Even Marco has stopped narrating every dune and geological curiosity, possibly because he's too busy hallucinating about celestial navigation. You catch one of the guards whispering to his horse. No one's in a good mood. The silence becomes oppressive, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional sound of someone vomiting behind a rock. You're not even sure who's still with you. Faces blur. All you know is that none of them are here to help you. They're here to endure, just like you. You hallucinate a few times. Once you see a fountain. Another time, a bathhouse. Most vividly, you imagine a bakery, complete with steam rising from the bread and the soft, forgiving cushion of a chair. You try to sit in the hallucination and fall flat onto a scorpion. It's fine. It stings you. But you are already considering self-harm, just to feel something. So technically, it's efficient. Days stretch. Time loses meaning. The sun rises and falls like a smug pendulum, measuring out your slow decay. You stop thinking in full sentences. Everything becomes sensation. Burning feet, blistered shoulders, the constant rattle of pebbles in your boot. Marco insists you're making good time. You consider burying him in a shallow sandy grave and continuing without him, but you're too tired to dig. When you finally emerge from the loot, days later, you're not the same person who entered. That person had hope. That person believed in things like travel, discovery, and the possibility of rinsing one's undergarments. You are now a creature of dust and pain, a walking blister, a cautionary example of what happens when optimism outpaces common sense. You find a well, you drink, you don't taste it. Your throat is too raw, your senses too dulled. Someone hands you bread, and you chew it like it's gravel. Marco congratulates everyone on a successful crossing. You want to tell him to go choke on his journal. Instead, you smile because you've learned something important in the loot. Hope is a mirage, and you're probably going to die in Asia. You miss the desert. Not because it was pleasant. Nothing about being slowly roasted in a salt-flavoured wind tunnel was pleasant, but at least it was honest. The sun wanted you dead and made no attempt to hide it. These mountains, by contrast, pretend to be majestic. The Hindu Kush stretches toward the sky like a frozen promise, with snow-dusted peaks and sweeping views that Marco insists are sublime. You describe them more as exhaustingly vertical and actively trying to kill you. The climb begins gradually enough. You pass through valleys where scrubby bushes cling to the earth like they're also trying not to be here. The air thins out faster than you expect. Breathing becomes a deliberate act, sharp, dry, and increasingly loud. You find yourself wheezing just from standing up too quickly, which is concerning since standing up is basically your full job description at this point. Marco, of course, is unaffected. He prances ahead like a mountain goat in fine boots, scribbling notes about elevation and echoacoustics, while you struggle to keep your lungs from falling out of your mouth. The cold arrives suddenly, and with a kind of smug finality. You didn't think it could get much worse than freezing in the desert nights, but high-altitude cold is a different animal entirely, one with claws. It gnaws at your fingers, chews on your ears, and makes a home in your joints. You bundle yourself in every layer you own, but it doesn't matter. The cold finds the cracks. It always finds the cracks. One night, you wake up with your nose frozen to your own sleeve. You consider whether suffocating in wool might be preferable to continuing. Your rations, carefully measured and packed all those weeks ago, have begun to betray you. The bread is stale enough to be used as a projectile weapon, and several of the grain sacks have developed a festive coating of blue-green fuzz. You pick out the mould with shaking hands and pretend it's seasoning. Marco claims the taste reminds him of a monastery cheese he once sampled near Acre. You remind him that it is, in fact, mouldy grain, and he suggests that you try having a more refined palate. You eat less each day, not by choice, but because there is less to eat. The animals are starving too. The donkeys have taken to chewing on anything vaguely fibrous. Tent ropes, saddle straps, your cloak. One of them attempted to eat your glove while you were still wearing it. Their bones show through their skin now, and they eye you with the blank desperation of fellow condemned prisoners. You begin to feel a kind of kinship with them. They smell worse than you do, but only barely. Altitude sickness joins the party somewhere above 10,000 feet. It arrives unannounced, dragging along dizziness, nausea, and the kind of headaches that make your vision buzz. One of the porters collapses mid-step and doesn't get up for a long time. When he finally does, he looks 10 years older. You try to encourage him, but your attempt at a rousing speech is interrupted by your own sudden urge to vomit over your boots. The mountains don't care, they just keep rising. The guide you hired back in the last village insists he knows the way. You believe him right up until the moment he stops walking, scratches his head, and mutters something about this path looking different last year. That's never what you want to hear on a ledge above a ravine. The group holds a quiet argument about which goat trail might be the correct one. You suggest flipping a coin. No one laughs. There are no coins to spare, and the last time someone tried to be funny, they slipped on ice and broke 2 ribs. Avalanches become a background threat, like thunder during a storm or distant coughing during a plague. You walk carefully, trying not to disturb the snowdrifts, fully aware that one loud sneeze could bury half the caravan. The tension wears on you. You dream of walls collapsing. You wake up convinced you've been buried. You haven't, yet, but the mountain is waiting. Patient, cold, inevitable. Meanwhile, Marco is composing poetry. He recites verses about wind-carved cliffs and the sacred hush of white. You listen, mostly because you're too tired to tell him to stop. In one particularly cruel moment, he compares the cold clarity of the mountains to spiritual enlightenment. You consider pushing him off the ridge. You don't because he's carrying the ink, and you'll be the one who has to clean it up. When you finally reach a sheltered pass, the group collapses like felled trees. There's no cheer, no sense of triumph, just shivering bodies, cracked lips, and the collective knowledge that you're still not even halfway. Marco declares it a valuable experience. You chew a mouthful of near ice and silently pray for a less educational future. You fall asleep with your knees tucked to your chest, your fingers clenched in frozen fists, and your breath misting in front of your face, like the last visible piece of your soul. You no longer dream of warmth. You just hope you'll wake up tomorrow without frost in your lungs and another donkey trying to eat your sleeve. You descend from the mountains with all the grace of a sack of spoiled lentils, every joint aching, and your internal organs rearranged by altitude. The cold finally loosens its grip as you stumble into the valleys of Bactria, an ancient crossroads of culture, empire, and very confusing food. Marco perks up immediately, rattling off a history of Alexander the Great and the Greco-Bactrian kings, like you're about to debate them over tea. You nod, mostly to disguise the fact that you're still trying to remember how walking works. The cities here don't look like Venice. They're low and sun-baked, built from mud brick and carved stone, sprawling rather than stacked. Marketplaces burst at the seams, with noise and colour, spices in woven sacks, dyes that stain your skin just from looking at them, and meat sizzling over open flames that smell both divine and deeply suspicious. You've stopped trying to identify what animal things used to be. You just chew carefully, and try not to imagine any of them making eye contact with you in a past life. Marco thrives in this chaos. He wanders through temples and mosques with wide eyes and a notebook that never closes. One day, it's a Zoroastrian fire shrine, its sacred flame flickering in a stone basin older than Christianity. The next, it's a Buddhist stupa, covered in colourful cloth and half-crumbled prayers. You trail behind, sticky with sweat and spiritual indifference, wondering how so many gods can coexist in a place where clean water clearly can't. The languages blend together until they become white noise: Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, Turkish, Greek, and something your guide claims is just a mountain dialect, as if that explains anything. You learn to smile vaguely and keep your mouth shut, mostly because opening it often results in accidentally insulting someone's grandmother, faith, or both. The last time you tried to compliment a man's horse, he challenged you to a wrestling match. You lost. Badly. You're still limping. The food is relentless, boiled, fried, sun-dried, and sometimes fermented in ways you suspect are illegal in more refined empires. Chickpeas soaked in vinegar, yogurt that bites back, flatbread that's either fresh or weaponized, depending on the hour. One night, you're served something yellow and spicy that makes your vision blur, and your nose run like it's fleeing the scene. You thank your host and spend the next 3 days clutching your stomach like it's trying to escape your body. Marco calls it a cleansing experience. You call it a medical emergency. Religious festivals seem to happen constantly. One week you're caught in a Muslim celebration, honouring a local saint. The next you're watching a group of Zoroastrians tie ribbons to trees and chant to the sky. Someone tosses flower petals on your head, and you assume it's a blessing until they start laughing. Marco dives headfirst into every ritual, asking questions, sketching symbols, occasionally attempting pronunciation. You try to stay near the camels and avoid getting initiated into anything by accident. At one monastery, a Buddhist monk gives Marco a long, thoughtful discourse on suffering and enlightenment. You sit beside a goat and try not to vomit. Your mind is too full of half-digested lentils, and your skin too itchy from flea bites to care about transcendence. You don't want nirvana, you want a bath, or at least a rag that doesn't smell like boiled feet. The locals are patient with you, which somehow makes it worse. They see you for what you are, a foreigner, clueless and exhausted, sweating through borrowed linen and mumbling in your sleep. They treat you kindly. They feed you. They offer tea. It would be touching if your stomach weren't so violently opposed to hospitality. Every gesture of kindness is answered by a fresh round of cramping, and by the time you're handed a second cup of butter tea, you're seriously considering whether dehydration is a more dignified option. Marco attends lectures, actual lectures, from local scholars in dusty robes who speak in 3 languages and reference texts you're fairly certain no longer exist. You carry his scrolls and try not to pass out in the corner. At one point, he asks your opinion on the spread of Buddhism along trade routes. You stare at him blankly and think about whether you packed extra undergarments. You didn't. You move constantly, city to town to village to city again. You never stay long enough to feel settled, only long enough to smell strange, offend someone accidentally, and ruin your digestive system in new and exciting ways. The land itself is beautiful, Rolling hills, sunlit plains, rivers that flash silver in the morning light. But you're too busy trying not to soil yourself to appreciate it. Beauty becomes background noise when your entire body is staging a mutiny. Eventually, you're back on the road, bumping along in a caravan, head pounding and stomach gurgling, while Marco recites Sufi poetry to a camel. You're not sure where you are. You're not sure where you're going. But you know one thing for certain. If you see another bowl of curdled yogurt, you're going to scream. You're not sure when it starts, this creeping sensation that you're being watched. Maybe it's when you spot a glint on a hillside that doesn't belong to the sun. Maybe it's when one of the porters swears he saw movement just off the trail, though no one else did. Or maybe it's the simple fact that you finally realised how pathetically robbable you are. Either way, the tension wraps around your ribs like a second shirt, tighter each day. You've been winding through mountain passes and desert gullies long enough to know that danger doesn't always announce itself with a scream and a drawn blade. Sometimes it just lingers, quiet, patient, waiting for the caravan to slow down, or for one tired assistant to lag behind, looking for a place to relieve himself. And this route, ancient though it may be, is tailor-made for ambush. You travel sections of what Marco proudly calls the Silk Road, as though that makes it safer. It doesn't. It just means the bandits here are well practiced and probably multilingual. Marco, of course, lectures about it. He talks endlessly about the Mongol postal system, how Genghis Khan's empire created a vast network of way stations and patrolled roads. He calls it the Pax Mongolica. You call it a scam, because while there may have been order once, that was decades ago. Now the stations are sparsely staffed, the patrols are few and far between, and the only thing the road is guaranteed to deliver is blisters. Occasionally, you pass a stone marker, or the burned remains of a checkpoint, relics of when this stretch of earth pretended to be civilized. You wonder if the guards abandoned it or were simply outnumbered. Your caravan is large enough to look like a challenge, and small enough to be a target. A handful of porters, a few merchants, some hired guards who spend more time arguing about whose turn it is to stay awake than actually staying awake. The Polos ride near the centre. You hover near the back, close enough to hear shouts, but far enough to feel vulnerable. You think about dying, not in a dramatic battlefield kind of way, but in the quiet, practical sense. Throat slit in the dark, body rolled into a ditch, your last possession, a broken sandal and a half-eaten fig. The guards start murmuring about suspicious tracks, footprints off the trail, displaced stones, unusual silence. You pretend not to notice how often their hands drift to the hilts of their swords. You start sleeping in shifts, or trying to. Rest becomes theoretical. You lie down, but your mind keeps inventorying every sound. Every whisper, every rustle of fabric or crack of a twig becomes a warning. You dream of knives and wake with your heart pounding, like a warning drum in your chest. Paranoia replaces blankets. It's not warm, but it keeps you alert. Trade, Marco explains during one particularly tense evening, is what keeps civilizations connected. You're all part of a grand exchange. Ideas, spices, metals, silk, people. You watch him sketch a trade network in the dirt while one of the camels makes unsettling noises behind him. Marco's unfazed. He traces a route from Samarkand to Kashgar, talking about caravans that bring porcelain west and silver east. He doesn't mention how many of those caravans vanish without a trace. You guess he's trying to keep morale up. It's not working. You take note of the valuables in your own pack. 2 ink pots, a badly sealed jar of dates, and a folded scrap of paper with a list of words Marco is trying to learn in Mongolian. None of it is worth killing over. But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe they don't kill you for treasure. Maybe they kill you because it's easy, or because they're bored, or because they want your donkey, which has recently stopped responding to commands and may already be working for them. There's one particular night you'll remember. The moon is full and the caravan is camped near a dry riverbed. A fire crackles low. Everyone is quiet. One of the guards swears he saw shadows moving just beyond the perimeter. He doesn't raise an alarm, just sits with his hand on his sword, and eyes scanning the dark like he expects it to blink back. No one sleeps. You sit with your knees tucked under your chin and wonder if this is how it happens. Not a dramatic charge, but a slow, deliberate peeling away of safety until the silence finally splits. But nothing comes, at least not that night. You pack up at dawn, exhausted and brittle. The guards say nothing. Marco yawns and mounts his horse, already thinking about his next passage. You glance behind you one last time, half expecting to see footprints where there should be none. The ground is empty. The threat has moved on, or maybe just moved closer. You keep walking, because that's all you can do. You realise you're getting sick. It creeps in slowly, like a rumour or a thief, hidden behind long days and longer nights. One morning your legs feel heavier. The next, your skin is too tight. You blame the heat, or the altitude, or the bread you ate 3 days ago that tasted like it had second thoughts about being bread. But by the 4th day, you can't sit upright without your skull threatening to slide off your neck. Everything aches, everything pulses, and worst of all, Marco notices. He suggests it's just fatigue. Everyone's tired, he says. We're all worn out. You nod, partly because you agree, mostly because your jaw no longer opens on command. You keep walking. That's what you do now. You walk, you breathe, you sweat. And lately, the sweating won't stop. It soaks through your clothes like you're leaking from the inside. You start to smell not just bad, but wrong. Metallic, sour, like something that's been left in the sun and quietly given up. You lose time. Minutes fall through your fingers like sand. One moment you're trudging through a dusty field of scrub grass. The next you're in the corner of a tent you don't remember entering. A wet cloth lies across your forehead, and there's a taste in your mouth, like copper and regret. A shape hovers nearby, Marco probably, mumbling something about airflow and herbal poultices. You try to thank him, but only manage a gurgle, which he seems to take as encouragement. The dreams begin shortly after, not the kind with meaning. These aren't visions or memories or anything poetic. They're just noise, colours that move wrong, voices that don't belong to anyone you've met. Once you dream that the caravan is inside your chest, and each step sends a jolt through your ribs. Another time, you're being eaten by the sun while a camel reads aloud from Marco's journal in perfect Latin. You wake up screaming and swatting at nothing, your body on fire and your blanket soaked with something that might be sweat or might be your soul trying to evacuate. You hear flies, not see, hear. The buzz becomes a constant presence, a chorus of winged vultures circling whatever part of you is closest to dying. You're too weak to shoo them away. At one point, you open your eyes and find them covering your hand, black specks against pale skin, like ants discovering a picnic. You try to lift your arm and can't. The flies stay. So does the buzzing. Occasionally, someone tries to feed you. Broth, if you're lucky. If not, it's gruel thinned with camel spit and optimism. You gag on it either way. Your stomach has decided to reject all substances, including hope. The cramps hit in waves, twisting your insides like a wet rag. Your spine aches in places you didn't know had bones. You lose the ability to differentiate between chills and hallucinations. Every surface feels wrong. Every sound is too loud. You beg for quiet, though you're not sure if you ever speak the words aloud. Marco insists you're doing well. You were alert this morning, he lies, as you blink unevenly and try to remember what a morning even is. He pats your shoulder like you've accomplished something. Like surviving this long is noble. It isn't. It's just inertia. You're too tired to die, too tired to even roll over. Instead, you lie still and let the fever hollow you out, from the inside, scraping at your ribs with red-hot fingernails. Time becomes a fluid thing, sometimes trickling, sometimes drowning you. You wake in the sun, then blink, and it's night. You hear voices outside the tent, but they melt together, as if everyone has agreed to speak in fog. You think you see your mother, or maybe it's a merchant from Bactria. Someone sits beside you and tells a story in a language you don't know. You smile because it's polite to smile when you're being visited by ghosts. Then one day, the sweating stops. You're still burning, but the wetness is gone. That's not good. That's how people die, quietly, after they've run out of water to lose. But the caravan needs to move, and so do you. 2 porters hoist you up like a sack of beans, and suddenly you're back on a donkey, swaying in and out of consciousness, while the world tips sideways, and someone's voice keeps calling your name, like it's trying to remind you that you exist. Eventually, you sit upright. Not well and not for long, but long enough that Marco says, "See? I told you it was just exhaustion." You try to laugh, you cough instead. Something yellow lands on your sleeve. No one comments on it. You won't fully recover, not here, not now. But you're mobile, and in Marco's world, that means you're fine. You've lost weight, you've lost time. You've probably lost chunks of memory you'll never get back. But you're still breathing. That makes you useful again. And so you ride, propped up like a puppet with half its strings cut, still half delirious, still sweating when you shouldn't be. And you wonder, not for the first time, if the worst is behind you. Then you see the horizon rising into endless grassland, and Marco pulls out a fresh journal. It isn't. You know you've entered Mongol territory because suddenly everything works. The road is wide. Not just passable, engineered, flattened, levelled and packed hard enough that the wheels don't sink and the donkeys stop making that high-pitched noise that usually means they're plotting your death. There are stone markers every few miles. You can actually follow the route without guessing or arguing with someone's cousin's map. It's unnatural. You feel like you've wandered into the part of the world that still has functioning adults. There are relay stations, actual buildings, where you can rest, resupply, and not immediately be stabbed. Fresh horses wait tethered outside, and uniformed messengers pass you on the road like streaks of efficient wind, bowing slightly before disappearing toward the horizon. Marco practically faints with joy. "It's like Rome," he says, breathless. "Only better." You think about how you haven't had a clean shirt since Hormuz, and decide that comparing anything to Rome right now is an insult to your suffering. The roads are part of the YAM system, a postal network so efficient it makes Venice look like a confused fishing village run by bureaucrats with head trauma. Couriers can carry messages across the empire in a fraction of the time it takes you to remove your boots. Every station is stocked with supplies and managed by someone who actually appears to know what they're doing. It's terrifying. You've never experienced this level of organisation. You're not sure you want to. Of course, none of this actually helps you. You're still on foot half the time, dragging your half-broken body across the steppe, while Marco raves about administrative genius. You're still bleeding from somewhere, possibly your gums, and every time you breathe too deeply, your ribs creak like wet wicker. But the mail is on time, so that's nice. The grasslands stretch forever. Rolling hills, soft green fields, skies that don't end. It's almost beautiful. You could almost forget the part where you were recently hallucinating insects and haven't had a proper bowel movement since Bactria. Herds of sheep and goats move across the plains, in clouds, trailed by nomads on ponies, who eye your caravan with quiet suspicion. You try to wave at one, but your arm won't lift above your shoulder anymore, so you just flap your hand like a dying bird and hope the message gets across. Yurts dot the horizon, round felt tents with smoke curling from the tops, like tiny practical volcanoes. Marco insists on visiting one. The family inside feeds you fermented mare's milk, which tastes like spoiled yogurt, vinegar, and burning. You smile because they're kind and armed. Marco takes notes on their interior design. You take notes on how quickly your stomach begins to reject everything you've ever believed in. You pass through Karakorum, or what's left of it. Once the capital of the empire, now a shadow of its former self, its grandeur relocated to Khanbalik, what Marco calls Dadu, and what the locals now call Beijing. There are still temples here, still shrines and carvings and ruins that whisper about power in languages older than your country. Marco weeps at a crumbling inscription. You try not to bleed through your shirt. The people are different here, calmer, more direct. There's an unspoken awareness that life is temporary, and you might as well get things done properly while you're still breathing. You admire that. Or you would if your admiration hadn't been replaced by constant physical discomfort and a growing resentment toward any form of competence that doesn't involve helping you lie down. At one-way station, a clerk offers you clean water in an actual ceramic cup. You hold it like it's made of gold. You drink. It doesn't taste like anything. That's the best part. Just water. No salt, no rot, no floaters. You nearly cry, but your tear ducts appear to have given up weeks ago. Marco writes constantly now. He's convinced he's documenting the most extraordinary empire in the world, and he's not entirely wrong. The Mongols have managed to link an empire from the Pacific to the Black Sea, enforce trade routes, standardize currency, and still have time left over to conquer new territories before lunch. It's all very impressive. You try to care. But every time Marco describes something as elegant or unprecedented, you're reminded that you haven't bathed in a month and you're pretty sure one of your teeth is starting to rattle loose. Eventually, you stop at a larger settlement where officials in silk robes ask to see your travel documents. Marco presents them with pride. You stand beside him like an unwanted sidekick from a story no one's interested in. The officials nod, stamp a scroll, and wave you on. That's it. No bribes, no shouting. Just efficiency. You've never felt more suspicious in your life. You ride on, slightly better fed, slightly less dying, and entirely unsure what to make of an empire that seems to function without needing your suffering. It's not fair, not after all the places that tried so hard to kill you, but there it is. The road is smooth, the couriers are fast, and Marco is talking about how this section of the journey might actually be pleasant. You cough into your sleeve and check for blood. There is some. Of course there is. At least the mail gets through. You thought you understood what flat meant. Fields outside Venice, the rooftops of Acre, the barren stretches of sand in the Lute. But the steppe redefines the word. It isn't just flat. It's eternal. A horizon that doesn't rise or fall. Grass, grass, and more grass, stretching in every direction, like the world's most committed joke. No trees, no rocks, no shade. Just gently rolling sameness under an indifferent sky. You ride, that's it. That's the entire day. Wake up sore, mount your animal, and ride until the sun moves. Your inner thighs develop a relationship with the saddle that borders on the theological, intimate, painful, and full of unanswered prayers. You try shifting your weight, adjusting the blanket, sitting side saddle. Nothing helps. The chafing becomes part of you. A new layer of identity, somewhere between the lice and your brittle sense of purpose. Time slows here. It doesn't stop exactly. It just forgets how to behave. You can ride for hours without seeing a landmark, a traveller, or anything that might suggest progress. You could be going in circles. You wouldn't know. Some days the only change is the colour of the grass underfoot, from pale green to yellow, from yellow to grey. The wind blows from every direction and somehow manages to smell like nothing. You'd almost welcome a bad smell just to break the monotony. Marco tries to keep spirits up. He recites poetry, describes clouds, compares the movement of the herd animals in the distance to classical sculpture. You want to punch him in the teeth, not because he's wrong, but because your last coherent thought was an argument with a marmot you're pretty sure wasn't real. Your mind has started to blur at the edges. Too much open sky, too few things to hold on to. You're not thinking anymore. You're drifting. You begin talking to your horse, not in a whimsical storybook way, You just run out of humans to complain to. You mutter apologies when you mount, threats when it stumbles, vague encouragement when it doesn't buck you off. The horse does not respond. You keep talking anyway. Eventually, you give it a name, then a personality. You're not sure if you're going mad or just adapting. Either way, it passes the time. Toilets as a concept vanish. You go where you can, when you can, behind what you can, which is usually nothing. Privacy dissolves into practicality. Everyone looks the other way. You stop caring if they don't. Your body becomes a travelling complaint, cramping, aching, leaking, and limping across the grasslands like a broken wheelbarrow full of regrets. Your skin is tight with grime. Your lips crack open like old parchment. You drink water when it's available and try not to think about what was floating in it. The herds pass occasionally, sheep, goats, horses, sometimes camels. Nomads drift across the land like ghosts, appearing and vanishing without warning. Some wave, some don't. A few approach your caravan and trade cheese, fermented milk, or dried meat for salt and iron tools. Marco interviews them. You chew cautiously and try not to ask what species you're eating. You've stopped asking questions generally. The answers are never helpful. The weather turns against you in new ways. Some days the sun bakes you in your saddle until your shirt fuses to your spine. Other days, rain rolls in from nowhere, drenching everything, turning the path to sludge and your boots into buckets. There's no shelter. You just ride through it, wet, shivering, resigned. You try to remember what it felt like to be dry. It's a theoretical concept now, like happiness or soap. One morning you wake to a sound that isn't wind or hoofbeats. Thunder. Real thunder. A storm rolls across the steppe like a living thing, and your caravan breaks into frantic motion. You lash things down. You shout at the donkeys. You climb back onto your miserable, flea-bitten horse and ride directly into the gale because there's nowhere else to go. Rain lashes sideways. Mud sprays into your eyes. Marco somehow finds it invigorating. That night, soaked through and trembling, you huddle in a canvas lean-to with your knees against your chest and your thoughts drifting into a dull fog. You no longer remember what the destination is, just that it lies somewhere east, somewhere beyond the next patch of grass and the next after that. Occasionally someone asks how much farther. The guides shrug. There's no map out here, no signs, just instinct, memory, and tracks in the dirt. You stare at the ground and wonder how many of those tracks belong to people who didn't make it. You wonder if anyone would notice if you just lay down and stopped moving. Probably not. The steppe would just roll over you, soft and indifferent. And so you ride, because you have to, because Marco says the Khan's summer palace is near, because the alternative is sitting still long enough to realise how much of yourself you've already lost to this place. The land changes before the city appears. Trees, first of all, real ones, not the twisted shrubs you've been squinting at on the horizon for weeks. Then the grass becomes softer, greener, thicker, like it's been groomed. Herds become denser, roads reappear. Not those half-forgotten caravan trails, but actual roads, compacted and marked and blessedly navigable. Birds return. You hear singing that isn't coming from Marco. Something about the air feels intentional, as if even the wind has been curated. And then you see it. Chengdu, also called Xanadu if you're feeling poetic, Kublai Khan's summer capital, a name that echoes like a myth and looks like a hallucination. White walls in geometric lines, golden roofs that gleam like coins under the sun, tents larger than city blocks, embroidered in silks and flying banners with symbols you can't read, but instinctively respect. It doesn't seem like a place humans built. It seems like a place that just appeared one day, fully formed, to remind you that you are extremely unimpressive. Marco sits up straighter. His eyes go wide. He looks like a child about to meet a god. You, on the other hand, are slumped in the saddle like a sack of spoiled grain, your shirt crusted with days of sweat, your lips sunburned into cracks, and your dignity long since jettisoned in a ditch somewhere around the Oxus. Every step closer to the palace reminds you that you smell like a regret and dress like an outbreak. Guards stop the caravan at the outer gate. They wear armour that looks ceremonial but not decorative, clean, purposeful, and absolutely capable of slicing you in half if needed. They inspect your documents, glancing at Marco and the older Polos with vague recognition. You are not acknowledged, not directly. One of them does glance at you sideways, but it might have just been confusion over whether you were alive or just tied to the saddle for easy transport. Inside the walls, everything is cleaner than you've seen in months. Stone paths swept free of dust, water flowing in carved channels, gardens that look like they've never known drought or neglect. You pass through neighbourhoods of courtiers and craftsmen, each more well-dressed and better fed than you thought possible. No one says a word, but you can feel the glances, some curious, some amused, a few openly horrified. You try to sit up straighter. Your spine cracks like old wood. The palace itself is a marvel. Massive halls supported by painted beams, murals of dragons and battles and celestial nonsense, silk tapestries that ripple even without wind. And food, everywhere, food. Pyramids of fruit, mountains of dumplings, entire tables arranged like edible landscapes. You've been chewing dried horse meat for weeks. Just the smell of roast duck makes your hands tremble. You're cleaned, or at least scraped into something approximating cleanliness, by servants who mutter in languages you don't speak. They remove your outer garments, and possibly part of your skin, and then present you with a robe that is finer than anything you've ever worn, and somehow less comfortable than a potato sack. You're herded into a ceremonial chamber beside Marco, who has never looked more smug. His hair is brushed, his boots are polished, he's already practicing his bow. The throne room is enormous, cool and terrifying. Columns tower overhead, incense burns in golden dishes, courtiers line the walls, all of them silent and expressionless. And at the far end of it all, seated on a raised platform that might as well be the peak of a mountain, is Kublai Khan. He doesn't need to look intimidating. Power does the work for him. He's dressed in white and gold, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. You realise with the subtle clarity of doom that this man could have you executed just to liven up lunch. Marco steps forward, bows, and begins speaking in one of the many languages he's been hoarding like treasure. You have no idea what he's saying. It's formal, reverent, probably flattering. You try to mimic the bow and nearly tip forward entirely. No one helps you. You're a curiosity at best, a stain at worst. You stand awkward and sweating through borrowed silk, while Marco talks history, an honour, and the glory of Venice. The Khan listens, nods, occasionally makes a gesture. You nod too, trying to look competent, though the only thing you can focus on is the fact that your left sandal is making a wet noise every time you shift your weight. At one point, you make the mistake of locking eyes with one of the court officials. He frowns slightly. You blink. He looks away. You try not to interpret that as a death sentence. When it's over, you're dismissed with a wave. Marco beams. He says something about diplomatic success and the honour of being welcomed into such a rarefied court. You're ushered out with the rest of the caravan, back into the maze of courtyards and pavilions. You are not dead. This is, technically, a win. But as you sit alone later, eating something you can't pronounce in a palace you don't belong in, surrounded by a language you don't understand, and luxury you'll never taste again, you realise something deep and unshakable. This place is extraordinary, and you're absolutely, laughably unworthy of it. Marco fits in. Not perfectly, of course. He's still a foreigner, still occasionally mispronounces important names and sometimes tries too hard to sound profound, but he adapts. He's clean, articulate, curious, and unreasonably confident. The court likes that. The Khan likes that. He speaks with advisors, listens to poets, asks intelligent questions about military campaigns, and delivers reports that actually get read. He has an audience here. You, on the other hand, have a job. Carry things, stay out of the way, and try not to offend anyone important by existing too loudly. Your living quarters are technically within the palace complex, which sounds impressive until you realise it's a narrow annex tucked between the kitchens and a stable wall. It smells like meat and horsehair. You sleep on a mat that's slightly less comfortable than your old saddlebag and share the space with a rotating assortment of servants, scribes, and at least one man who constantly hums to himself and has never given you a name. Privacy doesn't exist. Clean clothes are a luxury. Clean thoughts, even more so. You wake early, always. No one needs to tell you. You just know. Someone clangs a gong. Someone else yells in a language you haven't even tried to learn. And then it's time to haul scrolls, sort satchels, or hold a parasol over a Venetian merchant who claims direct sunlight gives him prophetic dreams. You're not even sure who you're assisting half the time. Everyone wants something carried. Everyone wants something translated. Everyone assumes you know where the next meeting is, what the ambassador just said, or which ceremonial mask is for the goat sacrifice, not the fertility dance. Marco gets invited to ceremonies. You get to prepare them. You set out rugs, carry incense, and occasionally sweep up whatever remains after the dancers have left. You're present at a sky burial once. You didn't know what that meant until you saw it. You still think about it when trying to sleep. Marco called it profound. You threw up behind a yurt. Food at court is both extravagant and dangerous. Meals are multi-course affairs featuring everything from dumplings stuffed with herbs to jellied horse tendon and spicy stews that seem designed specifically to test intestinal loyalty. Fermented mare's milk is everywhere. It's not optional. You drink it out of politeness the first time, then out of habit, then finally out of some twisted dependency, even though it continues to make your stomach feel like it's being chewed from the inside. Marco describes the flavour as earthy. You describe it, quietly and in private, as a mistake. When you're not hauling goods or serving as a glorified lampstand, you get to watch. Not attend, not participate, just watch. You stand at the edges of lavish feasts, war council meetings, religious rites, diplomatic exchanges between cultures that make your homeland seem like an unwashed rock. You hear languages from every corner of the continent. You see gifts you can't begin to appraise, jewels, ivory, silks, falcons, even people. There are scholars from Persia, astrologers from India, and holy men from Tibet. The air itself feels more educated than you are. Marco is in his element. He converses with Chinese mandarins, compares notes with Persian mathematicians, and develops a deeply troubling interest in Mongol siege techniques. He's constantly writing. You're constantly holding the ink. Sometimes he even remembers to thank you. Other times, he talks about his observations and his reports, and you get the distinct feeling that in his version of this journey, you were replaced by a particularly useful piece of luggage. You try to learn, you really do, but the lessons are brutal. One day, you bow too low and nearly knock over a table of ceremonial offerings. Another day, you mistake a high-ranking official's name for the word donkey and spend the rest of the week avoiding eye contact with anyone over the age of 20. You pick up a few phrases here and there, enough to nod in the right places, enough to apologise for breathing near a sacred object, but not enough to understand the jokes being told at your expense. Once a court artist sketches the delegation. Marco is portrayed in elegant profile, mid-sentence, gesturing toward a scroll. You're in the background, slightly out of frame, bending to pick something up. Your face isn't included. You're not even sure the artist knew you were part of the group. Marco compliments the likeness. You say nothing and carry the portrait back to the guest hall in silence. Still, it's not all suffering. Sometimes someone gives you fruit. Once you're allowed to sit on a cushion instead of a floor mat. A Mongol page teaches you how to properly fold a ceremonial scarf. You manage not to ruin it. You feel proud for 7 seconds before someone tells you you've delivered it to the wrong person. Progress, you suppose, but you don't belong here. Not really. Not among the silk-robed officials, the philosopher warriors, the dancers who move like birds, or the eunuchs who know more about international politics than you ever will. You belong outside, with the animals, with the dust. You're a function, a placeholder, something that moves when told and disappears when convenient. And yet, every morning you wake up and do it again, because the caravan is still moving, the Polos still need their documents, and someone still has to carry the ink. You don't remember the exact day someone says the word return. It doesn't sound real at first. You've spent so long moving east, one foot in front of the other, that the concept of going the other direction feels like a joke. But it happens, quietly, no fanfare, no sudden trumpet of closure. Just a meeting, a decision, and then Marco tells you to start packing the documents. You nod, because that's what you do. Then you sit very still and stare at the floor for a long time. You thought the return journey would be familiar, retracing steps, revisiting paths, maybe even seeing a few places in reverse and pretending you've grown wiser in the process. That was naive. You aren't taking the same route. Of course you aren't. Kublai Khan has other plans. He wants the Polos to escort a Mongol princess by sea to Persia, where she's meant to marry some distant relation who apparently doesn't know how lucky he is. This isn't a diplomatic mission. It's a glorified delivery. You're the packaging. The new route makes no sense. South to the Chinese coast, then sail around Southeast Asia, through the Indian Ocean, and eventually westward, if the storms don't kill you first. The Mongols provide ships, which is generous in the same way tossing someone into the ocean is a generous way of helping them learn to swim. You've seen these ships. They creak when no one's touching them. Some of the wood looks like it's already trying to return to being a tree. You board anyway, because you're not in charge. You haven't been in charge since Venice. The deck rocks before you even leave the harbour. Marco's excited. He says sea travel is faster. You say nothing, because you're busy locating the best spot to vomit without being in anyone's way. The princess boards with a royal entourage, silks fluttering, jewellery gleaming, surrounded by guards who look like they'd rather kill you than explain the rules. You try not to look at her. You try not to be seen at all. Then the storms come. Not the occasional swells of the Mediterranean, but full-body, bone-crushing tempests that spin the ship like a leaf and fill the air with the sound of cracking wood. You lose track of how many days you spend holding onto the rail, your face slick with salt and despair. At some point, a mast snaps. Another ship in the convoy vanishes. No one talks about it. You just move your things into the driest corner and try not to make eye contact with the horizon. Food is sparse, mostly rice and fish, both boiled to the point of meaninglessness. Everything tastes like wet burlap. You drink water that may have once been clean, but now carries the vague flavour of regret and bilge. Marco writes a poem about the sea's majesty. You gnaw a lump of salted something and think about dying with your boots off. The voyage drags through Java, Sumatra, the Maldives, and ports that blur together in a haze of heat and language. At one stop, someone tries to sell you a monkey. At another, you nearly contract something from a bowl of stew that twitches when stirred. You don't remember what island you're on when the fever returns. You lie in a corner of the hold, hallucinating coral reefs and being scolded by a giant fish that sounds suspiciously like your mother. When you come to, Marco is arguing with a local merchant about cinnamon prices. Eventually, the ship limps into a Persian port. The princess is delivered, wrapped and bowed like a royal gift. There is a ceremony. Marco is praised. The Khan's representatives are pleased. No one mentions you. You are a shadow on the deck, a burden on the manifest. You step off the boat with cracked feet and a chest full of stale air, and no one is waiting. The journey from Persia to the Mediterranean is long and ugly. Caravan trails, broken wheels, bribes at checkpoints. You speak less and less. Marco fills the silence with memories, observations, predictions. You nod when required. You do the work. You always do the work. You carry things, arrange campfires, translate greetings into broken phrases, and stare at maps that feel less like directions and more like accusations. When you finally see the sea again, the right sea, the blue of the Mediterranean hits you like a punch. It's familiar, almost kind. You travel the last leg by ship. A smaller one this time, blessedly uneventful. You arrive in Venice dirty, sun-bleached, and shaped like someone who hasn't been home in decades. Because you haven't. You step onto the dock and realise that no one knows who you are. Marco is greeted like a hero. Not right away, of course. He has to convince people who he is, tell the stories, prove his worth, but they believe him eventually. They always do. The scrolls are impressive. The journey is legendary. His name will be remembered. Your name never came up. You unpack the last crate, fold the last rug, sit alone in a storage room full of relics you helped carry across half the world. There's no reward, no thank you, just the quiet rustle of paper, the distant cheer of Marco recounting a story, and the realization that you've given years of your life to a journey that will never be yours. The city is the same in shape, but different in feel. The canals smell like fish and rot and unspoken politics, the way they always did, but now it all seems smaller somehow, narrower, dimmer, like your memories were stretched to make the place feel grander than it was. You shuffle off the boat with a gait that's somewhere between a limp and a collapse. Your legs still move, but not because you told them to. They just know this is where things end. You're not met by family, no crowds, no weeping reunions or poetic speeches. The guards don't recognise your name. A clerk at the dock shrugs when you explain you've returned from the Mongol Empire. He assumes you're mad. You can't blame him. You look like a ghost that's been misfiled. Skin weathered, hair matted, wearing what used to be silk, but now resembles shredded bark. You speak slowly, carefully, like someone relearning the rhythm of their own language. Eventually, someone points you toward the neighbourhood where your family used to live. You wander through alleys you once knew, past shop fronts that have changed names and faces that look at you with either suspicion or pity. The building is still there, mostly. A different family lives in it now. They don't know where yours went. Somewhere inland, maybe. The plague hit a few years ago. Names were lost. You were on the list of the dead. Officially, you don't exist anymore. You sit by the canal and try to feel something. Relief maybe, joy, anger. But there's just the gentle lapping of water against stone, and a silence that stretches between your ribs. Marco is already off meeting nobles, presenting scrolls, arranging scribes. He's telling your story, but with fewer characters. He doesn't need the part where you almost drowned in a rice basket or vomited into a diplomat's hat. That's not the version people want. You try to tell people where you've been, not boastfully, just because it's all you have now. You speak of Shangdu, of the great roads of the Khan, of deserts and mountains and cities older than time. Most of them don't believe you. They laugh politely or nod while looking over your shoulder. A few ask what spices you brought back. You didn't. You weren't in charge of the spices. You were lucky to keep a spoon. They lose interest quickly. Someone tells you Marco is writing a book. You're not mentioned. That doesn't surprise you. He's not cruel, just practical. There's no audience for the story of the tired man in the background. The one who held the pack, who stood outside the meetings, who learned just enough of each language to get insulted fluently in every region between Acre and Beijing. You are a footnote in a story that doesn't need footnotes. You find a place to stay. It's not much. A loft above a tannery that smells like its walls remember every hide that's passed through. You sleep on straw. It's somehow more comfortable than the palace mats. You get work lifting crates on the docks. Your back protests, but not loudly. Your body is used to pain now. It wears it like an old shirt. You eat alone most days. Sit alone most nights. You stopped looking in mirrors a while ago. What's there isn't you. It's a shape that made the trip and returned empty. Now and then someone recognises your name. A cousin's cousin. An old neighbour who squints like she almost remembers. They ask where you've been, and you tell them. They nod. Smile. Then they ask if you made any money. You didn't. They stop listening. You don't blame them. The city moves on without you. Children splash in the same canals you once ran through. Merchants argue over coins and cargoes. Priests light candles. The world you left behind never paused. You're not part of it anymore. You're not part of anything. Just a man who went too far and came back without proof. One morning, you watch the sunrise from a pier, the light rippling across the water like something too clean for this place. You sip weak wine from a tin cup and stare out toward the horizon you once followed for years. It looks smaller now. You realise without surprise that you missed the step. Not the comfort or the clarity or the purpose, there wasn't any. But out there, you were moving, becoming something. Even if it hurt, even if it killed parts of you that never grew back. Back here, you're no one again. But worse, because now you remember being someone. Or at least trying. You finish your drink, the sun climbs, the city stirs, and somewhere far off people are still telling stories about Marco Polo and the wonders of the East. None of them include the man who carried the ink. That's the end of tonight's long, sand-chafed stumble through a journey you never should have agreed to. Across deserts, mountains, oceans, and one very awkward diplomatic dinner with a man who could have you executed for blinking too slowly. You endured starvation, parasites, fermented horse milk, and the slow erosion of your soul. All so someone else could get the glory. If you're still awake, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about which part of Marco Polo's grand adventure would have broken you first. Sleep well, and maybe don't volunteer for any expeditions tomorrow.